Welcome. Today we look back at one of the most defining events in human history, World War II. This was a conflict that reshaped nations, transformed societies, and changed the role of the United States in the world forever. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains alone, but a record of decisions, sacrifices, and consequences that continue to shape our present. This is the story of World War II. World War II. Air War. How control of the skies decided the conflict. World War II was not decided only on the ground or at sea. Control of the air became one of the most decisive factors of the entire conflict. For the first time in history, air power shaped strategy, determined the success of invasions, protected supply lines, and brought the war directly to civilian populations. The struggle for air superiority transformed how wars were fought and redefined the limits of destruction. Before World War II, many military leaders underestimated the role aircraft would play in future conflicts. Planes were seen as support tools for reconnaissance and limited bombing. The war shattered those assumptions. Aircraft evolved rapidly from fragile machines into highly specialized weapons capable of dominating entire theaters of war. Fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, and reconnaissance planes became essential components of modern warfare. In Europe, the air war began almost immediately. German forces used coordinated air attacks to support rapid ground advances, striking enemy airfields, communication centers, and supply routes. This combination of air and ground power allowed Germany to overwhelm opponents early in the war. Cities were bombed, armies were disrupted, and morale was shaken. Air superiority enabled speed, surprise, and concentration of force. The United States entered the war with ambitious ideas about air power. American strategists believed that strategic bombing could cripple an enemy's ability to fight by destroying industry, transportation, and morale. This belief shaped the development of large bomber fleets and long-range escort fighters. Yet theory would soon collide with reality. Early bombing missions faced fierce resistance, heavy losses, and technological limitations that forced constant adaptation. In the Pacific, air power took on a different but equally critical role. Vast distances meant that control of the skies often determined control of the sea. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the primary instruments of naval power. Airstrikes could destroy fleets, protect landings, and isolate enemy positions without direct confrontation. The Pacific War became a contest of range, endurance, and coordination between air and naval forces. Air combat itself evolved into a deadly contest of skill and technology. Fighter pilots faced intense pressure, operating at high speeds, extreme altitudes, and under constant threat. Dogfights were brief but lethal. Bomber crews endured long missions deep into enemy territory, facing anti-aircraft fire and interceptor attacks. Survival depended on training, teamwork, and equipment reliability. The air war also brought unprecedented destruction to civilians. Cities became targets. Industrial centers were bombed repeatedly. The distinction between front lines and home fronts blurred. Air raids reshaped civilian life, forcing evacuations, blackouts, and constant fear. The psychological impact of bombing became a weapon in itself. World War II demonstrated that wars could be fought above nations as much as within them. Control of the skies enabled invasions, protected armies, and determined the pace of campaigns. Without air superiority, ground and naval operations became vastly more difficult. if not impossible. This series explores how the air war of World War II developed, how it shaped the conflict, and why control of the skies became essential to victory. From early experiments to total domination, the struggle for air superiority changed warfare forever and played a decisive role in determining the outcome of the deadliest war in history. The Battle of Britain. When air power saved a nation. In the summer of 1940, the future of Europe depended on control of the skies over a single country. After the fall of France, Nazi Germany prepared for an invasion of Great Britain. For the first time in history, the outcome of a major campaign would be decided primarily by air power. The Battle of Britain became a turning point not only in World War II, but in the entire concept of modern warfare. Germany's plan relied on achieving air superiority. Before any amphibious invasion could take place, the Luftwaffe needed to destroy the Royal Air Force. German aircraft began a sustained campaign against British airfields, radar stations, and fighter bases. The goal was to eliminate Britain's ability to defend its airspace, opening the way for invasion. The Royal Air Force faced enormous challenges. Britain was outnumbered in aircraft and pilots, and losses were difficult to replace. Yet several advantages proved decisive. Britain possessed an early warning radar system that allowed defenders to detect incoming raids and direct fighters efficiently. British command and control systems coordinated defenses in real time, conserving limited resources. Pilots could land, refuel, and return to combat quickly, while German pilots who were shot down over Britain were captured. The air fighting was intense and relentless. Dogfights filled the skies over southern England. Fighter pilots flew multiple missions per day under constant stress. Losses mounted on both sides. German bombers faced heavy resistance from British fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Despite inflicting damage, the Luftwaffe failed to destroy the RAF. A critical shift occurred when Germany changed strategy. Rather than continuing focused attacks on airfields, German bombers began targeting British cities, including London. The Blitz caused widespread destruction and civilian casualties, but it gave the RAF time to recover its air defenses. British fighter strength stabilized and German losses increased. By October 1940, it became clear that Germany had failed to gain air superiority. The planned invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. This marked the first major defeat of Nazi Germany in the war. Britain survived, remaining a base from which Allied forces would later launch the liberation of Western Europe. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that air power alone could determine the outcome of a strategic campaign. It showed that control of the skies was essential for invasion and defense alike. For the United States, which had not yet entered the war, the battle provided critical lessons. Radar, fighter coordination, pilot training, and integrated air defense systems would all influence American air strategy in the years ahead. Britain's survival changed the course of World War II. Without it, there would have been no base for American forces in Europe, no D-Day, and no Western Front. The battle proved that air superiority was not just a tactical advantage, but a strategic necessity. The skies over Britain became the proving ground for modern air warfare. What was learned there would shape every major air campaign that followed, including those fought by American air forces once the United States entered the war. American bombers. Over Europe, the cost of daylight bombing. When the United States entered World War II, American air planners brought with them a bold and controversial doctrine. They believed that heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations could defend themselves and strike enemy targets with precision in daylight. This concept stood in contrast to British strategy, which relied primarily on nighttime area bombing to reduce losses. The United States Army Air Forces committed to daylight precision bombing, convinced that destroying key industrial targets would cripple Germany's ability to wage war. The reality proved far harsher than theory. Early American bombing missions over occupied Europe and Germany faced fierce resistance. German fighter pilots were experienced, aggressive, and well-coordinated. Anti-aircraft defenses filled the skies with flak that tore through bomber formations. Losses were severe. Entire crews were killed or captured in a single mission. Some units suffered casualty rates so high that survival through a full tour of duty was statistically unlikely. Flying in a bomber was one of the most dangerous roles of the war. Crews operated at high altitudes in freezing temperatures, often without pressurized cabins. Oxygen masks were essential, and frostbite was common. Missions could last 8 hours or more, with long stretches of tension, followed by minutes of intense combat. When fighters attacked, gunners had seconds to react. A single hit could ignite fuel tanks or disable vital systems. Early in the campaign, American bombers lacked adequate long-range fighter escort. Fighters could protect bombers only part of the way to their targets before turning back due to fuel limitations. Beyond that point, bombers were vulnerable. German fighters concentrated attacks on unescorted formations, inflicting devastating losses. Raids deep into Germany, such as those against Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943, resulted in catastrophic casualties. Despite these losses, the bombing campaign continued. American commanders believed that abandoning daylight bombing would concede the skies to the enemy. Pressure from political leadership and faith in the doctrine drove continued operations. Crews returned to the air again and again, knowing the odds. Morale was strained, but discipline and belief in the mission sustained the force. The turning point came with technological and tactical adaptation. Long-range escort fighters, most notably the P-51 Mustang, entered service in large numbers. These aircraft could accompany bombers all the way to their targets and back, engaging German fighters aggressively, rather than merely defending bombers. Air superiority gradually shifted. German losses increased, and experienced pilots became difficult to replace. As escort coverage improved, bombing accuracy and effectiveness increased. American bombers targeted aircraft factories, oil refineries, transportation networks, and ball-bearing plants. The cumulative impact was devastating. German aircraft production was disrupted, fuel shortages crippled mobility, and the Luftwaffe was forced into a defensive battle it could not win. By early 1944, the Allies had achieved air superiority over Western Europe. The cost of this victory was enormous. Tens of thousands of American airmen were killed or captured during the bombing campaign. Yet their sacrifice enabled every major Allied operation that followed. Without control of the air, the invasion of Normandy would have been impossible. Armies could not move freely, supply lines would be exposed, and enemy counterattacks would be far more dangerous. Daylight bombing reshaped modern warfare. It demonstrated both the power and the cost of strategic air campaigns. Precision bombing did not end the war alone, but it weakened Germany to the point where ground forces could advance with overwhelming advantage. For the men who flew these missions, victory was measured in survival as much as success. Their experience stands as a testament to endurance under extreme danger. The skies over Europe became a battlefield where courage, technology, and adaptation determined the outcome of the war. Air power in the Pacific: carriers, range, and total destruction. In the Pacific, air power evolved along a very different path than in Europe. Vast distances, scattered islands, and limited infrastructure meant that traditional land-based airfields were often unavailable or vulnerable. Control of the skies depended on mobility, range, and coordination between air and naval forces. This reality elevated the aircraft carrier from a supporting platform to the central instrument of naval and air warfare. Before World War II, battleships were considered the decisive weapon at sea. The Pacific War overturned this belief almost immediately. Aircraft carriers demonstrated that airstrikes could sink ships, destroy airfields, and decide battles far beyond the reach of naval guns. The early months of the war proved this lesson brutally. First with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and later in a series of carrier engagements that reshaped naval strategy forever. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked a decisive turning point. American carrier-based aircraft destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in a single day, crippling Japan's ability to project air power across the Pacific. This battle demonstrated that air superiority at sea could determine strategic outcomes without direct surface engagement. From that point forward, the Pacific War became a contest of carrier groups, pilot training, and industrial capacity. As the war progressed, American carrier aviation expanded rapidly. The United States produced carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots at a pace Japan could not match. American air groups improved tactics, emphasizing coordinated strikes, fighter escort, and aggressive interception. Radar-equipped ships provided early warning, allowing carriers to launch or defend against incoming attacks. These advantages gradually tilted control of the skies toward the United States. Range became a decisive factor. Aircraft capable of flying farther could strike enemy bases, protect fleets, and support amphibious landings. The introduction of long-range bombers, particularly the B-29 Superfortress, transformed the Pacific Air War. Operating from island bases, B-29s could reach the Japanese home islands. Initially, missions faced technical challenges and heavy losses, but improvements in tactics, navigation, and maintenance increased effectiveness. Strategic bombing in the Pacific reached unprecedented levels of destruction. Firebombing campaigns against Japanese cities devastated urban centers built largely of wood. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed in single nights. Civilian casualties were enormous. The air war brought total destruction directly to the Japanese home front, blurring any remaining distinction between battlefield and civilian life. Carrier air power also supported ground operations across the Pacific. Airstrikes softened defenses before amphibious landings, destroyed enemy supply routes, and provided close air support to troops fighting ashore. On islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Okinawa, air superiority was essential to survival. Without it, ground forces would have faced even greater losses. Japanese air power, once formidable, steadily declined. Losses of experienced pilots at Midway and later battles could not be replaced. Training programs were shortened and quality suffered. As American air superiority increased, Japanese forces turned to desperate measures, including kamikaze attacks. These suicide missions inflicted damage and psychological strain, but they could not reverse the strategic imbalance. By 1945, the United States controlled the skies across the Pacific. Japanese aircraft were scarce, fuel was limited, and air defenses were overwhelmed. Air power had isolated Japan, destroyed its industry, and supported the advance of American forces across thousands of miles of ocean. The Pacific Air War demonstrated that control of the skies could decide the fate of nations separated by vast distances. Aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, and integrated air-sea operations transformed warfare permanently. The lessons learned in the Pacific would define naval and air strategy for generations to come. Fighters, aces, and the human side of air combat. Behind the statistics of aircraft production and strategic bombing were individual pilots whose experiences defined the air war on a human level. Fighter combat in World War II was fast, violent, and intensely personal. Unlike ground battles that unfolded over hours or days, air combat was often decided in seconds. Pilots lived with constant pressure, knowing that a single mistake could be fatal. Fighter pilots faced extreme physical and mental demands. They operated at high speeds and altitudes, enduring cold, hypoxia, and intense G-forces. Combat required split-second decisions while managing complex machines under stress. Dogfights were chaotic, with aircraft twisting and diving at close range. Visibility was limited, and situational awareness determined survival. Many pilots described combat as overwhelming, a blur of motion, noise, and fear. Training played a critical role, but it could not fully prepare pilots for combat. Early in the war, American pilots often faced more experienced opponents. Losses were high until tactics and training improved. Over time, training programs emphasized formation flying, teamwork, and energy management rather than individual heroics. Survival increasingly depended on mutual support within a flight or squadron. The concept of the ace emerged from this environment. Pilots credited with multiple aerial victories became symbols of skill and morale. Yet the reality behind ace status was complex. Many aces survived long enough to accumulate victories due to experience, luck, and support from their units. Others achieved success briefly before being killed or captured. The focus on aces sometimes obscured the fact that air superiority was achieved by collective effort rather than individual performance. In Europe, fighter pilots played a crucial role escorting bombers and intercepting enemy aircraft. Long-range escorts reduced bomber losses and forced enemy fighters into costly engagements. Pilots flew repeated missions, often several per week, with limited rest. The psychological toll was significant. The anticipation before missions and the tension during combat wore down even the most confident pilots. In the Pacific, fighter combat occurred over vast stretches of ocean and isolated islands. Pilots faced additional risks, including ditching at sea far from rescue. Navigation errors could be fatal. Combat often occurred near carrier groups or over jungle-covered islands where downed pilots faced capture or death. The environment amplified stress and isolation. Camaraderie among pilots became essential. Squadrons developed strong bonds, sharing experiences and coping mechanisms. Humor, rituals, and shared routines helped manage fear. Losses were felt deeply. When a pilot failed to return, empty chairs and unused bunks became reminders of mortality. Replacement pilots arrived regularly, often inexperienced and vulnerable. Technological evolution changed the balance of air combat. Improved aircraft performance, better radios, and radar integration increased effectiveness. Pilots learned to trust their equipment and each other. Yet technology did not eliminate risk. Mechanical failures, weather, and human error remained constant threats. The human side of air combat also extended to moral challenges. Pilots bombed targets that affected civilian populations. They grappled with responsibility and distance from the consequences of their actions. Some coped by focusing narrowly on the mission. Others carried lasting questions about their role. By the end of the war, fighter pilots had become central to achieving and maintaining air superiority. Their experiences reflected the broader reality of World War II. Victory depended on individuals operating under extreme pressure within complex systems. The air war was not an abstract contest of machines. It was a human struggle fought at high speed, high altitude, and high cost. Strategic bombing, effectiveness, ethics, and consequences. Strategic bombing was one of the most controversial elements of World War II. It represented an attempt to break an enemy's ability and will to fight by striking industrial centers, transportation networks, and cities from the air. For the United States and its allies, bombing campaigns were seen as a way to shorten the war and reduce losses on the ground. Yet the reality of strategic bombing raised difficult questions about effectiveness, morality, and civilian suffering. American air doctrine emphasized precision bombing. U.S. planners believed that destroying key industrial targets, such as aircraft factories, oil refineries, power plants, and rail hubs, would cripple enemy war production. This approach aimed to focus destruction on military-relevant infrastructure rather than population centers. In practice, precision was limited by technology, weather, navigation challenges, and enemy defenses. Bombs often missed their intended targets, and urban areas surrounding factories suffered heavy damage. In Europe, the combined American and British bombing campaign devastated Germany. Daylight raids by American bombers targeted specific industries, while British night bombing focused on cities and infrastructure. Over time, the cumulative effect was severe. German oil production collapsed, transportation networks were disrupted, and aircraft output was strained. The Luftwaffe was forced into defensive battles it could not sustain. Strategic bombing did not defeat Germany alone, but it weakened the Axis war effort significantly and enabled ground offensives to succeed with fewer losses. The cost to aircrews and civilians was enormous. Bomber losses were high, especially before air superiority was achieved. Civilian casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands across Europe. Cities such as Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne suffered extensive destruction. The moral implications of these attacks were debated even during the war. Leaders weighed civilian suffering against the imperative to end the conflict as quickly as possible. In the Pacific, strategic bombing took a different form. Japanese cities were largely built of wood, making them highly vulnerable to firebombing. American B-29 raids destroyed vast urban areas, particularly in Tokyo, where a single raid in March 1945 killed tens of thousands. These attacks devastated Japan's industrial capacity and civilian morale. Yet Japan did not surrender immediately, highlighting the limits of bombing alone in forcing political decisions. The culmination of strategic bombing came with the use of atomic weapons. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki introduced destruction on an entirely new scale. From a military perspective, they achieved the goal of ending the war quickly. From a human perspective, they inflicted unprecedented suffering. The long-term effects of radiation added another layer of tragedy. Strategic bombing thus reached its most extreme and consequential form. The effectiveness of strategic bombing remains debated. It weakened enemy capabilities, diverted resources, and supported ground operations. However, it also demonstrated that air power alone could not always compel surrender without complementary political and military pressure. The ethical questions raised by civilian casualties continue to influence international law and military doctrine. World War II forced nations to confront the realities of industrialized warfare. Strategic bombing became both a tool of victory and a symbol of the war's moral complexity. Its legacy is inseparable from the broader lessons of the conflict: that technological power must be balanced against humanitarian considerations, and that decisions made in war carry consequences long after the fighting ends. Air superiority and ground victory. Why armies could not advance. Without the skies. By the later stages of World War II, one lesson had become undeniable. Modern armies could not operate successfully without control of the air. Air superiority was no longer a supporting advantage. It was a prerequisite for victory on the ground and at sea. For the United States and its allies, achieving dominance in the skies transformed the nature of combat and made large-scale offensives possible. In Europe, the importance of air superiority became clear in the lead-up to D-Day. Allied air forces systematically targeted German airfields, radar stations, bridges, rail lines, and communication centers. This campaign limited the Luftwaffe's ability to respond and disrupted German movement across France. When Allied troops landed in Normandy, German forces struggled to concentrate reinforcements or launch coordinated counterattacks. Allied aircraft attacked convoys, columns, and strongpoints almost at will. The ability to move by day without fear of air attack had vanished for Germany. As American and Allied armies advanced inland, close air support became essential. Fighter bombers attacked enemy positions, tanks, and artillery with speed and accuracy. Pilots worked closely with ground units, striking targets identified by forward observers. This coordination allowed ground forces to break through defenses that would otherwise have required costly frontal assaults. Air power reduced casualties by suppressing enemy fire and limiting counterattacks. In the Battle of the Bulge, the temporary loss of air support due to poor weather demonstrated how vulnerable ground forces became without control of the skies. When clouds lifted, Allied aircraft returned in force, destroying German supply lines and vehicles. The German offensive quickly collapsed. This contrast reinforced the decisive role of air power in sustaining ground operations. In the Pacific, air superiority was equally vital, but operated across even greater distances. Carrier-based aircraft and land-based bombers isolated battlefields before ground troops arrived. Airstrikes destroyed coastal defenses, airfields, and supply depots. Without air cover, Japanese forces struggled to reinforce or resupply isolated islands. Once American aircraft controlled the skies, Japanese positions were effectively cut off, turning many garrisons into stranded pockets of resistance. Air superiority also protected logistics. Supplies, reinforcements, and evacuation depended on secure airspace. Transport aircraft moved men and material across oceans and jungles. Medical evacuation saved thousands of lives by rapidly removing wounded soldiers from the front. Without control of the air, these lifelines would have been impossible. The psychological impact of air superiority was profound. Soldiers advanced with greater confidence, knowing enemy aircraft posed little threat. Conversely, enemy troops lived under constant fear of sudden attack from above. Movement became hazardous. Morale suffered. the battlefield increasingly favored the side that controlled the skies. World War II demonstrated that air superiority multiplied the effectiveness of every other force. Tanks, infantry, and artillery could maneuver more freely. Naval forces could operate with reduced risk. Commanders could plan offensives knowing that enemy movement and communication were constrained. The war's later victories were built on this foundation. By 1944 and 1945, Allied control of the air was nearly complete across major theaters. This dominance did not end the war by itself, but it made victory inevitable. Ground forces still had to fight and die, but they did so with decisive support from above. Air superiority became one of the defining lessons of World War II. It reshaped military doctrine and remains central to modern warfare. The conflict proved that control of the skies was not an optional advantage, but a determining factor in the outcome of global war. Legacy of the Air War: how World War II changed warfare. Forever, World War II permanently transformed the role of air power in warfare. What began as a supporting element evolved into a decisive force capable of shaping entire campaigns and determining strategic outcomes. By 1945, no serious military planner doubted that control of the skies was essential for victory. The air war had redefined how nations fought, planned, and understood modern conflict. One of the most important lessons of the war was the integration of air power with ground and naval forces. World War II demonstrated that aircraft could not operate effectively in isolation. Success required coordination across services. Fighters protected bombers, bombers weakened enemy defenses, and ground forces exploited the resulting advantages. This integration laid the foundation for joint operations that remain central to military doctrine today. The conflict also accelerated technological innovation at an unprecedented pace. Aircraft design advanced rapidly, driven by the demands of combat. Faster fighters, longer-range bombers, improved navigation systems, radar, and jet propulsion all emerged during the war. These advances did not end with victory. They shaped post-war aviation, influencing both military and civilian air travel and ushering in the jet age. The air war also changed the relationship between military operations and civilian populations. Strategic bombing brought war directly into cities, erasing the distinction between front lines. World War II reshaped the world we live in today. Its victories, losses, and lessons remind us of the cost of global conflict and the value of cooperation. By remembering this history, we honor those who lived through it and better understand the world they left behind. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.